Welcome back, guests. Good to see you, Geoff.
Good to see you. I'm back on the left coast after 2 weeks from Toronto,
Was
which
it
was
that
very
long?
nice.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
welcome back. Welcome back. And good to see you, Mike.
Thank you, Kate. And I'm back from a day trip to my favorite place in the world, the Fraser Canyon. Fill you in
Ah,
later on that. The great
yeah.
trip to Lytton on the weekend.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I have not been wandering far afield, but we will catch up. Okay. Today in the strategy suite, speaking of, the theme, I'm going to call it like grumpy old men. There's some grumpy people of other genders and ages, but generally it's a lot of grumpy old men. Very on brand for Geoff and Mike, and I feel like they're going to pile on. We're going to talk about how Don Wright is grumpy about housing. Mike is grumpy about BC's cabinet representation in Ottawa. Everybody's grumpy about Bill 15. David Eby is grumpy about Eby-Begg, who's grumpy about Eleanor Sturko. The Conservatives are grumpy about the appointment of Michael Bryant. And MLA Darlene Rochford is grumpy about two-timing MLAs. So lots to cover later today. But in the meantime, but first, we've got our guest today, Jatinder Rai. Jatinder is the founder and CEO of Response Advertising, which specializes in multicultural communications, the largest firm of its kind in Canada with offices in Vancouver and Toronto. He brings deep insights into BC and Canada's diverse communities and how public debates, especially during elections, play out in a much different way, and why governments and organizations ought to be communicating with these substantial communities. He hails from the Cowichan Valley, but resides today in South Surrey. Welcome to Hotel Pacifico, Jatinder.
Thank you, Kate. Looking forward to the conversation, and hi to Mike and Geoff.
Good morning.
Kate edited out the part about you're a Boston Bruins fan.
Yeah.
So I'm going to add
Do you
that.
need to get out of your system?
I'll let you. I'll
Go.
let the listeners judge you
We do
accordingly.
less sportsing than our sister pod curse, so you should.
Mike, I do have something for you.
Okay. That's avert your eyes, YouTube viewers. Avert your eyes.
Okay.
Walked into that one, didn't I? Jeez.
Yeah, you did. You literally, yeah. Okay. You paved the way for that one. Jatinder, let's move on from sports and let's step back for a minute because I am curious. You are somewhat unusual for your specialty in multicultural communications, and I'm curious kind of how this came about.
Yeah, so well, thank you for the question. It's interesting. Essentially, I grew up in in Cowichan Valley in Duncan, predominantly, I would say not a very multicultural communities, but I went traveling. I went to Asia, and while I was away after university, realized and understood a lot of the cultures that were happening around the world, and came back and thought that that was something unique. And myself and my family were kind of unique in that perspective. My father immigrated to Canada in 1970, and we came 4 years later. And I just remember it was something unique that every time, in the old days, BCTV would have something around the SOGI, and we would run to the TV to catch 20 seconds, 30 seconds of that newscast because it felt like there was something that was speaking to us, my sisters, myself. And so that was unique. And so as I went through university, and I always loved politics, public policy, and then got into marketing. And then for me, they kind of meshed together, the politics and the marketing, because you're actually, that's kind of trying to segment the market. And then 1995 happened when Hong Kong transferred to China. And then we saw a lot of Hong Kong Chinese come to Canada, and especially to Vancouver. And what you saw at that time was that private sector, all these companies wanted to get access to those segments and would offer communications in, I would say, services in language. And that's when I saw the opportunity. I thought, hey, really for Canada, immigration's always been the key component from growth perspective. And that this was something unique and something interesting. And there's maybe something that I could take advantage of.
Well, you've seen Metro Vancouver in particular evolve a lot in those 25 years. By my last time I checked, I think 50% of the region is visible minority, but you go and look at Richmond, 75%, Surrey's 60%, Burnaby 65%. What are we missing in the analysis of politics and business generally when we're just looking at the Vancouver Sun and listening to CKNW and watching the TV news? There's a different conversation happening in some of these communities.
And as I mentioned earlier, we were so happy to see our community representative or seen on BC TV for 20 seconds, 30 seconds of a clip. That meant a lot. over that time, you've just seen, and it started with the Chinese community, Singtao, one of the largest newspapers in Hong Kong when it came over, Fairchild. And so they evolved. And because, as we know, content is king, they provided content to the Chinese community, news, culture, entertainment that was very much for that segment. And so now, fast forwarding, I think to today, you see that with Chinese and South Asia and Filipino and others. But really, what's happening is that the media has become so sophisticated. And unlike the English media, it's not fragmented. It's not fragmented to the same degree. So you have Fairchild, both radio and television, which has 80% penetration. I can't think of a single English medium that has that kind of penetration.
Now, are they Mandarin and Cantonese, Fairchild?
They are. So they transfer. Initially, they were just Cantonese. Now they've got, have much more of the programming on Mandarin because of the immigration pattern that's changed in the last 10 years. And same thing with South Asian. Just I think it was launched last week. ATN, Asian Television Network, one of the largest in Canada, offers 54 channels for the South Asian segment in Canada. So those are 24 hours, 7 days a week. So that content that's being, so we're in a global world now and content is coming. And so I think the conversation that's happening, because, it's like, rather than getting 20 seconds of a clip, you're getting 2 hours of an issue that's important to you. And I think that's what really has changed and shifted over the years.
But isn't it almost a one-way street, Jatinder? I mean, I would be very interested to hear those kinds of debates, but I don't speak Punjabi or I don't speak Mandarin. It's arguable that I think that those populations are more broadly informed about what's going on in the province because they get the provincial news and cover all of the normal events you would in an English language publication or media outlet, and a huge amount of additional content from their own community.
Yeah, you're bang on, Geoff. And I think a perfect example for me in the last, it was during COVID. What would happen is you would get an update of what's happening in the province, BC. You'd get, Dr. Bonnie Henry would come on and would speak about the cases that were here. And it would be provided in language so that the communities could understand and what was happening. But then they were also getting the same information about what was happening in China and in India and the impact the COVID was happening. And so to your point, yes, it's their understanding. I actually think the understanding in the multicultural ethnic communities around social, political, economic issues are much more pronounced than they are even the English, because to your point, you're only getting one version, like what's happening in Canada or what's happening in BC. They're getting a global perspective. And especially and then there's a comparison of what's happening, economic development that's happening in China and India, leading the world in growth. And they're seeing what's happening in Canada or lack thereof. And then it's really difficult for them because for a lot of them, they came here for, an opportunity for economic, social mobility opportunity. And when they don't see that, there's some sort of level of frustration, but it's because of direct comparison that they're doing with their home country back in Asia.
The most striking example I saw that was an event organized by John Horgan when I worked for him at the Crystal Mall in Burnaby, just at the onset of COVID. And when we arrived for the event, there was nobody there eating, and all the Asian language reporters were wearing masks and wondering why Horgan wasn't. They were far ahead of the rest of the community in terms of their awareness of COVID and what some of the countermeasures would be.
Yep, you're bang on. And so, because they're getting 24 hours, news cycle, and the difference is, I think, is we're in that cycle as well, but ours is the depth to those issues isn't to the same degree. We're covering other elements of what's happening in the U.S., what's happening, but for them, it's their local news pertaining to their own community here, but also that international perspective from their home country.
Mm-hmm.
Can actually, I want to touch on this before I forget, because you raise an interesting point, like talking about these differences in a global perspective that these media outlets are providing. Is there a nuance to how the Trump issue is playing out in ethnic media?
It is. And so I think, and we saw that, and I think this is, I want to just be clear. I was not involved in any of the political campaigns, and I haven't been for a long time. but just an observer. So it was interesting and that was a sort of I'm sure we're going to get into the latter part of this conversation. In this federal election, the Liberal Party focused on Trump, Trump, Trump. And so the Trump issue to the Chinese, South Asian, or any ethnic other communities was there, but their view of it wasn't to the same degree, or their perspective about the threat wasn't to the same degree. And partly it's because there is a sense of politics that's being done in India, and it is, you saw that relationship that the president has with the Prime Minister of India. It's a positive one, and they get along. And so the threat, that nuance wasn't there. And with the Chinese media, it was more seen as like, we know that there's two big economies but they're going to figure this out. But the Canada role, or the nationalism or patriotic element, it wasn't to the same degree. It didn't play out in the same way. And what we heard, or my team heard over and over again, was, well, the president is looking after his own people. The president is looking after the US. Isn't that the right thing? Shouldn't more Canadians be doing that? And I think that's the difference that played out in the election. That's why you saw, I think, the success of the Conservative Party that happened in Surrey, in Richmond, and other parts, and in the GTA. I mean, the Bramptons nobody ever thought that the Conservative Party would win ridings or win seats in Brampton or the GTA or the Peel area, and they did.
Well, let's just build on that, the political map in British Columbia, because we can go back to the BC election in October, and very similar to the federal results last month, where there's a south of Fraser, north of Fraser type of phenomena there. The BC Conservatives did better than people expected in Surrey. The federal Conservatives almost overtook the Liberals in Surrey, made big gains in the popular vote this time in the more South Asian ridings, and then lost the South Surrey riding, which is mainly white, to the Liberals. And then on the Chinese side, the Conservatives won Richmond from the Liberals in an election where the Liberals were doing really well, and they almost won seats in Burnaby. So it does seem like when you overlay demographics, South Asian and Chinese populations, these last two elections, the Conservatives have been gaining market share. And when you look at the more Caucasian ridings, because you can also look at the North Shore too, it's gone the other way. What's your analysis of that?
So I think one of the things is that, like I said earlier, for most immigrants, my parents came 50 some odd years ago, but there's a sense that they, even to this day, they came to this country for opportunity and economic growth, and to be successful. And so they feel that the system is kind of broken now. There's some challenges that come with it. And I think both the BC Conservatives and Mr. Poilievre spoke to this in the sense of the issues that really mattered. And like I was saying, the comparison of the federal Liberal Party, they focused on Trump. And that was really the only thing. But whereas the Conservatives really focused on crime, growth, jobs, taxes, and those things, they align really well with the younger generation who feel like, hey, I'm trying to make my ends meet day to day, paycheck to paycheck. And that's the mindset of a lot of the new immigrants. And so that line, and so those issues didn't speak to them, the ones that the federal party was speaking about. In regards to the provincial, I think a couple of things. And, I think since 2017 to now, I think there's this view that there's a change happened provincially, and the expectation that things would happen. And so I think, what is it, 8 years later, the view is there's still no hospital in Surrey. Transportation is an issue, and public safety and crime has become an issue. And those are all the things that the BC Conservatives hammered the NDP on. An example I'll share is from a messaging creative perspective. The BC NDP had messaging which was based on, hey, the BC Conservatives are going to bring back tolling on the bridges. they sold a hospital, they sold the land for the hospital didn't get built. In the meantime, the contrast was the BC Conservatives, who had advertising on both Chinese and South Asian medium, which said, going into a scenario creative, which was a son and a mother, and then the son desperately trying to take his mother to the hospital, and there was a 14-hour wait, and she was struggling, and him talking to her about, hey, I can't get you into the hospital. I know you're in a lot of pain, but there's nothing I can do. It's 14-hour wait. So that is something that really resonated, because that's a hospital issue, and that was emergency closures that were happening. So that was news versus, I think, the NDP messaging, which was people didn't believe it, that the tolls were never going to come back, most likely. So there was a contrast to that, and the trust factor that happened, because they were seeing something on everyday life, which is around public safety, which is around hospitals, closures, things like that. So I think the messaging resonated much more, and I think that made an impact. And I think also from a public policy perspective, those are issues that really matter, and they were able to resonate with them.
Related to that, actually, I just want to pick up on, I think a lot of folks, when Brent Fertney, when his tweets came out, his really problematic statements on I guess X, that had racial and racist undertones.
Brent Chapman.
Oh, sorry.
Chapman. Yeah.
Oh, Brent. Oh gosh, yeah, Brent Chapman. When those came out, there was a lot of an assumption that would really hurt him in the Pervs. And I think what we saw was that's exactly where it didn't matter, and that voters there were paying attention to different issues. I mean, did you ever think for a minute that was where it was going to play out, or did you know that this just wasn't where those voters were going to turn their attention?
I knew when it happened that it wasn't going to have the same impact that it would have, and not. So, as Mike calls it, north of the Fraser. And I think the bigger impact was going to be north of the Fraser rather than the Surrey riding. And it was really, I think it's part based on the fact that the mindset of, we've come a long ways in, providing equity and inclusion, but there's still folks that feel that there's that issue. But, they know that's already part of the kind of in the system, but they were willing to overlook it because of the day-to-day struggles and the challenges that they have about getting their kids into school, going to the hospital, getting home and to work, and all. So those are material things that impact families a lot, and I think there's also this sense like there's sense like when it got discussed on let's say example was on Red FM. Yes, people called and said, this is terrible. I can't believe he would say things like that. But then you would also hear people phone in and saying, but, I'm struggling. I'm struggling with taxes. I'm struggling with carbon tax. I'm struggling to get my mother to a hospital or find a doctor. And so those things kind of, I think just weighed more heavily. And I think those are where the decision, or ballot box, if you want to call it, where decisions were made on.
Guess, remember those Saturday morning cartoons with Yosemite Sam chasing gold in the Klondike Rush? Well, if that rackin' frackin' varmint, that galoot, was around in 2025, he'd be after something totally different, and here's why. Did you know copper prices hit a whopping $10,000 per ton in 2025, making it the new gold rush of our time? And here's the real jumpin' Jehoshaphat moment. Did you know that a single kilometer of fiber optic cable contains enough copper to connect over 100 traditional phone lines? And that's just the beginning. From powering our renewable energy future to connecting our 5G networks, copper isn't just valuable, it's essential for our planet's green transformation. And speaking of transformation, next week we'll explore how our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is turning this copper story into something extraordinary, taking an innovative approach that's not just about retiring old copper networks, but about creating lasting social change in communities across Canada. Get ready for a story that connects environmental sustainability with digital innovation and community impact.
Jatinder, from conversations with NDP candidates out in south of the Fraser, an issue that came up quite a bit, frustrating them, was SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity, which was used in a recall campaign against Rashna Singh, and it's not an issue that's isolated to multicultural communities by any means. But there's a view that the NDP raised that issue a lot and failed to deal with the anxieties that it triggered in a lot of supporters who otherwise were sympathetic to the NDP. Is there a way for the center left to communicate those issues that is less threatening to people in multicultural communities?
I think the challenge, Jeff, with that is I think there is for sure. I think the consultation, the due diligence, and nuance to it is missing. It's that there aren't enough people that can provide. So, I'm just going to use probably a terrible example on this. Is that imagine having 6 or 7 people around the table and saying, "Here's a big public policy idea. How are we gonna communicate it?" And not everybody around the table is going to agree with how to play that out. And how it's going to get communicated. But there's a discussion and a debate. I think what's happening within government right now, and both federally and provincially, is that you might have one person at that table from that community. And that person says, "Hey, I think it's done this way." And everybody goes, "Yep, I've been there." And somebody says, "Jatinder said this. Hey, it must be the right way." No, because there has to be much more of a dialogue and to saying, Jinder might not be right on this. He might have, he might be 40% right, but we need to make sure that we're communicating. I think there is a right way to message on SOGI. I just think that there wasn't enough work done to pressure test it as to how it would work for the Chinese and South Asian. They're different. And it was just seems like, hey, we're going to treat this as human rights and push it out. So I say this to a lot of our private sector clients. The way you communicate in English can't be the same way that you communicate in multicultural media. It shouldn't be 100% different, but it needs to be nuanced. The basis of it should be the same, but then you have to figure out what is it relevant? How can I make this relevant to that segment, to that community, so that they understand why we're doing it, why it's important, and how it could be effectively communicated.
But I can suggest 3 other ways it could break down. It could be me as the chief of staff saying, "Here's our response on SOGI," which will be completely tone deaf in a language community, where I'm asking a person to be the spokesperson for that on all these open line shows, and that candidate or that MLA is going, "Hey, I don't want to be the SOGI person. I came to fight for a better hospital."
Yes.
And then right down to rank and file members on the ground who are very uneasy and unsettled by it and don't get what they consider a credible response.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was just gonna say, finish off that, Jeff. I think it is. I think that's once again. I think it's that you need to have. I don't want to say the right people, but you have to have people around that don't necessarily agree with you, but be able to bring that perspective and saying, what you're going to do here, it's going to have some consequences. Let's address those consequences so that we're aware of them, rather than just saying, can we get this translated into Cantonese and Mandarin, and can we push it out, and can it be out for tomorrow for Tsingtao? And it's the same thing around advertising that we struggle with a little bit with our private sector clients, is that we want them to be, the brand to be consistent, but it needs to be unique. And then it has to, I always ask my staff is like, why is it, why do we want to do this in these segments? And to make sure that, we are fully understand the nuances.
I'd like to ask you about inside political parties. In my political lifetime, I've seen the growing influence and clout of the South Asian community in Liberal politics, BC Liberal politics, but I think the same can be said in the NDP and the Conservatives. I'm interested in your insights on why the South Asian community, and particularly Punjabi-speaking, take to the party politics so effectively. Because I think a percentage, when you look at it in a leadership race or a nomination race, even in certain ridings, the percentage of South Asian members is usually quite high relative to the rest of the list. And can you break that down for us, why that is the case?
I think it's partly because they feel the front door isn't open and that they can't get access to be at the table, and that the only way that they can get access to be at the table, to have their voice heard, or not even voice, be part of the system and to be play a role, that they need to demonstrate their strength and their power and their influence. But it comes from, like the South Asian community, especially the Sikh community, was very prominent in getting the South Asians to get a right to vote in Canada in 1947. And so they got together. There was a Sikh temple on West Second at that time, and pooled their money and sent somebody on the railway across to Ottawa, and saying, we as South Asians, Indians who are part of the Commonwealth have a right to vote. And we served in the First World War, we served in the Second World War under the British Empire. And so they were successful. And with that, it came not just for the South Asians to be able to vote, but also the Chinese and Japanese. So from a democratic perspective, they've always been very sort of eager and prominent in what their rights. And so I think it has much more of a history with them. But I think, currently, like that's in the system, in their DNA, but they feel like that they don't get their say or they don't get their way, and that they need to be able to show that influence. And the way to do that, and it's worked over time. That's what's happened, right? Like you've had people who are, Uber organizers been able to take advantage of that, or be able to do that, and be able to at the table. But then I go back to the same thing, is like, you might have one or two people that, that where we're headed right now is the demographics are, I think, 96.4% of the growth in population came from immigration. So we had, I think it was 2.1 million people that have come to Canada in the last 5 years. Well, a lot of them are going to be Canadian citizens, are going to be part of the political process. And so, as I was in 1995, trying to get ahead of the curve, I think the political parties, governments, public policy need to think about the influence the demographic shift is going to happen in 5 years or the next election. Next election is going to be very different than the election that we just had, because a lot more of them are going to become Canadian citizens and have a right to vote.
But not all these communities get involved in the political system to the same degree, right? So the Sikhs and the South Asian community are really active. The Chinese have huge numbers. I mean, there's over 500,000 in Metro Vancouver, I think, but there's lots of more Chinese candidates now, more Chinese Canadians being elected to office, but they're not as, I would say, present in party processes. And we're starting to see Korean and Filipino and other communities represented. But I mean, I guess these diasporas are bringing kind of traditions with them to Canada, I guess. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I do. My prediction is that you will see more Chinese engagement moving forward. I think maybe not to the same degree as the South Asian, but I think you'll see, and I think you're already starting to see that with more candidates. And I think they're understanding it, the same way that the South Asians, to be able to have some influence, you need to be engaged. And so I think that you will see more and more of that. And I think you'll see more of the both the Filipino and the Korean community, not to the same degree, like they're not as large, but you'll see that moving forward at a higher penetration or a higher engagement than we've seen previously.
Don't you think some of these communities come with different expectations of politics, which are formed by their own, their own cultural background from the mother country, I guess? Because in my experience, to make it personal, I found that the South Asian community had a higher expectation that I would intervene, campaign, and advocate for their community in issues like taxi driving and other regulations in very specific ways, which, in my view, they had every right to expect, but they did so to a much higher degree than some other communities. In the Chinese community, often the expectations were more broad brush about how general policy would go. It would be drug policy or, where social housing goes. And I think those are challenging differences for people who get into elected life, because those communities are participating in politics, as Mike says, for very different reasons. And I agree completely with your view that they go where the door is open. It's not necessarily a partisan decision. I'd take a look at someone like Chuck Au, who ran for the NDP a couple of elections ago, now as a Conservative member of Parliament. And I don't put that down to, maybe some people would think that shows lack of commitment, but he's a person of significant.
Tried to be a BC Liberal candidate at one point,
Professional.
too.
Was he one of those two?
I tried to be. Yeah.
Tried to be, yeah. But when you look at his resume, he's a very credible candidate.
Yeah.
And he has significant support, and finally he's achieved quite an important position. So I think that's an interesting other dynamic of it, which is what the expectations are of the communities themselves.
Yes, and I think I remember when Ujjal Dosanjh became the premier, and there was probably as many federal liberals, BC liberals, probably supported him in that in that leadership, and that probably surprised a lot of people. But there was also this sense of, hey, we are going to make one of our own, the first premier, South Asian premier in Canada and for BC. So there's that sense of how do we lift our community? What can we do for our community as a whole? There's that sense as well. But to your point, Geoff, I do think it really is, where can I get access and have some influence? That becomes the sort of the key factor.
Right.
So staying with that, I think, Jatinder, you're kind of casting us forward a bit about the trajectory for this strong influence of ethnic voters in Canadian elections is only going to become more and more so. And we certainly saw that validated in this recent federal election. I'm thinking going forward, if you kind of have these this is a simplification, but there are two areas I know where you work, Toronto and Vancouver. You have these kind of two areas with these very, very vote-rich burbs, with these different kind of different makeups of different ethnic group and different types of voters. How salient sort of over the next few years do you see some of these kind of big geopolitical issues being, and how Mark Carney responds, becoming to his political fortunes? To say it a little less in a less complicated way, is he going to end up in some tough spots? Because the diaspora, the different communities in Vancouver and Toronto, they're not the same, and they could put you in some tough decisions.
Yes, but I would say they have more in common. The Chinese, South Asian in the GTA will have more in common with their counterparts, their communities in Vancouver. I think the challenge is, to simplify it, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, probably 20 years ago, I would say, on the federal side, it was really easy. You just had to say, for the federal Liberal Party, we're pro-immigration, and you would get that vote. And what ended up happening, so sorry, two parts to it. We're pro-immigration, and we'll visit your temple, and that's pretty much about the outreach that we're going to do. And I always joke with people in the private sector, imagine me going to my client saying, hey, in order for you to sell more cars, I'm going to take you to the temple. And I would get laughed out of the boardroom, and people saying that's not a communication strategy, right? And so now I think what's happened, immigration is kind of off the table, both because of the demographic shift or the challenges we have around growth. So you saw that the federal Conservatives were as pro-immigration as the federal Liberals were. So then it moves to other social issues or economic issues. And I think that's going to be the struggle for Mr. Carney, is that I don't think he understands those nuances yet. Hopefully people around him will help him with that. An example is I would use that, things like almost 80% of the immigrants that come to this country end up being small business owners. And there was nothing in that platform that helped. And we know in BC, the South Asian community is heavily into construction and housing. Well, that's really struggling right now. So how are you going to deal with that when you're seeing, those small businesses that are drywall, electricians, plumbers, who the houses aren't being built because the inflation, and they're not working. And so I think, it's going to be very difficult moving forward. And I think it's because of you could only ride that Trump train for so long. And I think that's where I think it's going to come to a head for the federal government.
Jatinder, this has been so interesting. I'm glad, full circle, we've come around on Trump, but you can't avoid him.
Yeah.
But it's been such a pleasure having you on. Thanks for joining us today.
No problem. Thank you. I enjoyed it. Hopefully I'll see you guys and, well, less of Mike, but more of Geoff and you, Kate.
That'd be great. Thanks, Jatinder.
Thanks a lot.
Gas or electric? How about all the above? Lately, I've been talking about how much we rely upon our province's gas and electricity systems working together. We need both systems working together to safely, reliably, and affordably meet the needs of British Columbians. And if you're a FortisBC customer that qualifies, you can have all of the above, gas and electric. Last year, FortisBC introduced a new rebate program for eligible customers who replaced their home's older gas heating system with an electric heat pump and high-efficiency furnace. Sure, I'll do a fist pump over a heat pump, especially when paired with a high-efficiency furnace. How's that work? A dual fuel system or hybrid provides whole home heating and cooling and is a good option for homeowners who are replacing an aging gas furnace and want to upgrade to a reliable and efficient system, keeping their home comfortable year-round. It includes an electric heat pump for cooling during warm weather and space heating during milder conditions, and a high-efficiency gas furnace for heating during those cold BC winter days. So just like our provincial energy systems, you get the advantages of both gas and electricity at the household level to ensure your home energy remains affordable, efficient, and reliable. Kind of like a hybrid car, gas and electric working together. This dual fuel offering is part of FortisBC's commitment to offer the next generation of rebates for high-efficiency technologies and systems to help achieve provincial climate action goals by harnessing the strengths of both energy systems. Find a full list of rebates and energy efficiency information at fortisbc.com/rebates. FortisBC, energy for a better BC and a better podcast.
Geoff, nice to have you back this side of the country.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. Weather much the same as Toronto, maybe not as sunny as Toronto. I would say that, but very nice, very nice visit to Toronto. Lots going on there. Not much hockey success, but lots of other stuff.
Oh, I think they're in deep depression this week.
It was as bad as it could have been.
Yeah.
Oh God. Mike, you got anything happier to report? How was your long weekend?
Well, it's nice to actually just have a good old-fashioned strategy suite this week. We've had lots
good
of crazy
old-fashioned one. Yeah.
We've had lots of crazy formats lately, but it was fun last week with the discourse crew from Alberta, Erica and Cheryl. I've got great feedback from listeners on that. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in the pod, I was happy to do a little sprint up to Lytton on the weekend because one of our former Hotel Pacifico guests, Denise O'Connor, the mayor of Lytton, had a housewarming. And
that's wonderful.
Her house is rebuilt on the site of
Yeah.
the one that burnt down. And I think there's 9, I might be off on the numbers here. This seems like maybe 10 or a dozen houses that have been built in Lytton now, and more are starting to be built. There's others that are not being built yet because they're not insured or there's still ongoing archaeological issues.
As we approach the 4-year anniversary?
4-year anniversary on June 30th. But there is signs of progress. The Legion building is starting to go up. And one little nice thing is that there's a museum, private museum of Chinese history that burnt down with all of its collection. And lots of people have helped restock a new museum, which opened recently. I think Minister Chandra Herbert was there for the opening. And I got a chance to see it on the weekend too. And it's really great to see those things come back to life. So anyways, so there's a little report from the hot spot.
Good.
Amazing.
Better late than never.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of reports, feedback, we've been getting some in our YouTube comments. And I think some, you know what, guests, just so, or listeners, Mike gets very excited when you target your feedback at me and Geoff and leave him out of it. It's his favorite type of comment. So he welcomes all types.
Not that we're thin-skinned.
I don't know how I got away on that one because I feel like
I feel like you've done it too. But
I feel like I've been a bit of a culprit on this particular matter.
Should I read it out? Should I clue our
Sure.
listeners in? Yeah. Okay. So this is from YouTube. A little bit of feedback. This is the second go by a host at the paranoid notion of Laurentian elite. Mark Carney, born in the Northwest Territories and raised entirely in Alberta, is now characterized by Miss Hammer as, quote, extreme Laurentian elite. I don't argue the quote. Ordinary elite doesn't cut it anymore. Miss Hammer needs hyperbole stacked on her conspiracy hamburger. That does sound delicious. I don't argue. One would encourage this parochial pair from Hotel Pacifico to travel to Montreal or Quebec City and float their risible Laurentian elite theory to the audience at the chamber with a straight face. I mean, Geoff, field trip, road trip, what?
I think they complain about
I'm always
Laurentian
ready to
elites.
go to Quebec City.
I think they complain about Laurentian elites in Montreal and Quebec as well. But anyways.
Yeah, I
Please
think so
announce
too.
to the Francophone audience that they and they are in cahoots with Toronto to dominate and control the country. Kate and Geoff should prepare themselves to be laughed out of the room. Okay, Geoff.
Boy, you guys have to go to the detention room here.
I mean, it's a good takedown. Full
Francophone
points
community
for
is not monolithic, and those who favor sovereignty would certainly agree there's a Laurentian elite thwarting that at every turn. And there's a federalist elite. Anyway, I just think it's an obvious fact for people who spend time back east in the political world, especially in Ottawa, that there's a group of people, many in the public service, many in politics, lots of them bilingual and so on, who by all kinds of means become critical decision makers. So I disagree with the conservative side of the room on many things, but I think there
parochial
is
pair of conspiracy hamburger eating.
Oh yeah, this is so.
With your hyperbole stacked on top like cheddar cheese. So.
I think there's a case here he's trying to make that you can't, like, you have to be born Laurentian elite, and that you can't kind of become it, which I reject. But I also think there is a version of the born into the Laurentian elite. They're real. They are a bit different. They tend to have cottages in eastern townships.
Take a case in point. I think that it's fair to assume that possibly one of Christopher Freeland's children, whose godfather is Mark Carney, may turn out to be an Laurentian elite. It's not an open and closed business, but it does happen. Yeah.
All right. Mike, are you feeling like we've been sufficiently pilloried here?
Oh, well, you guys are so parochial.
Yes. Okay.
But
fine. I'll get a t-shirt.
It's a teachable
Says
moment.
the man just in from Lytton. Okay.
Yeah. Man of the people here. Man of the people, straight in from Lytton.
Yeah. Well, a little hyperbole sauce on my hamburger.
Okay, that's good. We like those spicy comments from the viewers.
I'm always happy to be risible.
And I will reconsider my adding, the extreme in front of a lunch and learn. Maybe that's unfair. I'll meditate on that.
Anyway, keep the cards and letters coming.
Okay, please do. Yeah. And if you want to just pick on Geoff and Mike, I'm okay with that. But we'll take it from, we're glad to discuss it. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about what's got Mike grumpy in life in general, which is BC's representation at the cabinet table. We got 2 out of 29. And I think, is there any argument? Let's actually make sure we're on the same page here. Does anyone here want to argue that the ministers of state count?
They don't count.
No.
Secretaries.
No, okay, it's unanimous. Okay, that's not, it's hotel policy.
So they're trying. Some are trying to make the point that BC has 5 ministers. I mean, technically, have 5 people with the honorable designation, but the 3 secretaries of state do not. They are appendages to their minister, and they do not sit in the cabinet room unless they're invited to come.
Yeah, they're invited in. They're not permanently there on all decisions.
And let's face it, they're at the bottom of the pecking order. Of those, if you add them to the 29 ministers, there's 39 people with special titles. But those 3 secretaries of state from BC, they're nowhere near the center of power.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about that, Mike?
Well, if you look at, first of all, BC did its job for the Liberals by electing 20 record number of MPs.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, I'll sound like a broken record here. I've talked about the gender issue for BC, in particular for the Liberals, because 16 out of 20 Liberals are men. And so the gender math worked against British Columbia in this particular cabinet.
Not that you're against gender math. I think we better say that.
Well, but let him, he's going to venture into a minority opinion, I think.
Well, first of all, I would say in terms of absolute numbers, BC, based on its population, as a share of cabinet, as a share of the caucus, should have been good for 4 real ministers, but we got 2. And part of that is, frankly, what kind of cabinet material are we sending back? to Ottawa. That's definitely a
They're
part of the
they're
issue.
newer. They're a newer bunch would be another factor, right?
But part of the issue, and I think this affected actually Alberta more succinctly than BC, is that they're clearly, they've said they want to have a gender balanced cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
So Corey Hogan from Calgary was left out of cabinet, and they arguably should have had two ministers from Alberta, and maybe he should have been the one minister. But and then you look at Winnipeg; they have no ministers, but there's a female representative from Northern Manitoba, so no cabinet representation from Winnipeg, and they have 5 MPs from Winnipeg. So it's like the West really punched below its weight as part of that cabinet, and I think it's kind of unacceptable, especially when we're looking at a national unity issue in Alberta, and we're just giving an excuse to be more upset with the Liberal government. But BC in particular, like we historically have weak cabinet representatives. There's been times when there's an exception to that rule, but
You're going back to Ray Perot or something?
our entire since Confederation, we've had a prime minister for 90 days, and we've never had a finance minister in the entire Confederation.
One piece of trivia.
And that's just an example of how BC just maybe we don't care out here. Maybe we don't. Maybe it doesn't matter, British Columbians. But I just find like, man, this particular lineup, two ministers, and not particularly senior ministers. Gregor's, arguably the middle of the pack in terms of clout in the cabinet, but the other one, Jill McKnight, she's bottom tier in that cabinet. So BC does. I mean, Ontario, obviously, in Quebec, like. Obviously, they have. I mean, Atlantic Canada has a lot more clout than British Columbia does, for sure.
But the finance minister thing, there's got to be a lot of provinces who've been locked out of that. That's just got to be a pretty not one note, but a real Ontario bias and Bay Street's bona fides.
Given how many MPs we send back through the Liberals.
I hear you. Yeah. Well, I don't hear you, though, because I think I know where you're going.
Well,
because you're going to argue this is more important than anything else.
Well, thank you for reminding me of the point I was going to raise, which was... Confederation is a confederation of regions. It's not a confederation of genders. It's not a confederation of age groups. It's a confederation of regions. And I'm all for having a gender balanced cabinet, or even more women than men, if the case may be. But when it comes down to it, I think region is probably the most important consideration a prime minister has to weigh in building a cabinet, because it's regions that are the pain point in federal-provincial relations.
But there's another category which Carney had to deal with. I agree generally, Mike, with your claim that BC's underrepresented. I think that's true. There's no argument on that front. But I don't think that a reasonable prime minister can turn away from other representational requirements like gender, like diversity, and those kinds of things. And in the BC case, we had a number of front benchers, including one who wrote a note to the electorate about how qualified he was. That was Jonathan Wilkinson, but was somehow overlooked. And this was the extra thing for Carney. He had to get away from the Trudeau look, although how much he succeeded in that is debatable.
But I mean, it's interesting to me that there was 6 former ministers, and it's still like, did he change it enough? I'm like, I don't know how. Like,
well,
he kind of went as far with that as he possibly mathematically could. Almost.
I just disagree, though, that the gender rule is absolute, but we're not absolute on the regions, and to me, it's the regions. I mean, look, Quebec's threatened to separate. Alberta's having a debate right now. Like that's where the fault lines lie in Canada. And whether gender is 55-45 the other way, does that matter as much? I don't think so.
Oh, I'll bite on that. I'll bite on like a sort of, does it hurt your kind of 50 bullseye? And could region in that point be a more important factor? Okay. But I think like getting close to 50-50 is really important on the gender thing. And I think like this is tough, because I think the other thing I'll say, like, the way we're represented in Ottawa is all reflected of the geography of Confederation, and there's the reflection of that. And then what happens, unfortunately, is we're correcting something historically, which is, predominantly it was white men, and perspectives were lost around that. And so I still think there's something more important about that piece compared to the regional piece.
Well, I'll mention Joyce Murray, who passes the gender bar and was the fisheries minister for BC, from BC, not for BC, but from BC, which was considered a big deal, although the fishing industry is a shadow of what it once was. And I don't think that she was able to contribute very much. That's not a comment on her necessarily, but you can put people in there. They may not be able to carry any water. Suddenly I'm drawing a blank, but a very capable woman who was the minister from Delta, Carla
Qualtrough.
Yeah, very, very capable person, I thought, and never really was able to shine in it. So you may get the seat, you may not get a portfolio that's much used to, but that brings us maybe to Don Wright, doesn't it?
Yeah. We have a clipping this week. So we have a clipping coming from Don Wright's Substack, actually writing about Gregor Robertson's comments on housing. Do we have a little clip here to read from it? We do. Okay. And for those who are interested, Don Wright's Substack is called Blindingly Obvious, which everyone should subscribe to. And I'll quote directly from Don. On his first day as housing minister, Gregor Robertson was asked whether housing prices need to go down. He responded, quote, "No, I think we need to deliver more supply, make sure the market is stable. It's a huge part of our economy. We need to be delivering more affordable housing." The immediate response to this of anyone with the most rudimentary understanding of supply and demand would probably be something akin to, say what? How do you make something more affordable without lowering its price? Okay, so Don wasn't the only person.
He's a real rabble-rouser, that Don Wright.
Okay, well, let's talk about this a minute. Like I had a bit of an instinct, when I first heard this, when this was breaking, Gregor's comments there's a little bit, was this maybe a reflection too that Gregor's been out of politics for a little bit? And if you go back in time, this was maybe more an appropriate comment. There was a little bit more of this tug and pull. And I feel like that view is not aged well. And we're leaning a bit more into it's unaffordable and we're not going to protect boomer assets as much. Does that feel fair?
Depends on your perspective, obviously. And I think it's more complicated than just boomers too. Because I mean, if you're a millennial who bought a townhouse last year and if carrying 85% of it on your value of it on your mortgage, that going backwards on that is backwards on that stuff scary. Too. Yeah. So I think Gregor's, welcome to federal politics, Gregor. And that's a real high wire act he's going to have to walk as housing minister is, how to communicate your way through that. And he had to clarify it, and now it's kind of brought up a bit of a discussion about, well, what exactly was his record as mayor on housing anyways? Because the rest of Canada doesn't really know that much about it. So.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, having been on Gregor's council for 9 of the 10 years I was there, I could say many things about this, but he said out loud what people have often thought in their inside voice in the whole housing debate. The one thing everybody agrees on is you need more supply. So you always talk about supply. What no one has decided to do is get up and say, I found a solution. I'm going to crash the market, as Mike says, put all of those voters who have a mortgage underwater just for a couple of years. Or maybe I'll do a bit of both. I'll try to raise incomes and reduce prices at the same time, which is very hard to do on the raise income side. And somewhat easy to do, and we're finding it happening anyway because of a whole bunch of forces. Like, to my way of thinking, we've only been saying in the last few weeks out loud that the BC housing market is in deep, deep trouble. There were a couple of articles in the Vancouver Sun. We're months behind Toronto in drawing that realization. It was, until recently, a third of the BC economy. So if housing slows down, you really throw out an anchor. As Jatinder was saying, for all of those South Asian home builders, and there's also Vietnamese and platoons of Chinese Canadian home builders, never mind the big developers everybody likes to get angry about. So I suspect there's a lot of trouble and difficult discussions ahead for Gregor because he has to strike that balance and somehow stand up in the next period of time, because this is how I understand the federal commitment, a new Crown corporation charged with identifying land, identifying infrastructure requirements, and building hundreds of thousands of Canadian homes for Canadians that will be in the lower price point. Like, this is a huge challenge, and we'll see if Mark Carney has got the chops to help Gregor drive the public service in that direction. I don't think the infrastructure is there to do that at the moment.
All right.
It's better get through our grumpy list. We got a lot of grumpy
We got a lot of
topics
grumpy
here. Yeah.
Can we grump about Bill 15 for a minute?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Moving back to BC, Bill 15 is getting pretty controversial. Final week next week to get this through, and the government still seems pretty poised to forge ahead. Sorry, this is the infrastructure bill that, again, like actually to relate it
Fast
to
track.
like, yeah, well, can I relate it to the conversation with Jatinder, right? It's really about like getting those schools and those hospitals built that, a really critical part of the voter base is
Collaboratively.
Okay, say more, Mike McDonald. What does that mean, right?
It means the provincial government's legislating itself a very heavy stick to get the projects it wants through, but not natural gas. No, there's a specific carve-out that this does not apply to natural gas or LNG, as Premier Eby specified in his op-ed last week, which I assume was a requirement of being nice to the Green Party. But
and the Greens still aren't supporting this, right?
The grumpy list includes the Greens. It includes the UBCM. It includes First Nations leadership. Includes environmental groups. Includes the Conservatives.
Not the mining companies.
No, the sun is shining on mining. There we go. And clean energy. So, you got a wind farm? Hey, it's already approved. Boom, I just had the idea to do a wind farm. It already got approved, just like that by the BC government. So,
Any sign they're going to blank?
So what's the public think? Public probably thinks, well, they're trying to get shit done.
I think the public likes it.
Yeah.
I think the public likes it. And, you and I have both been in the legislature or working around the legislature in the last week, where there's always a sense of total, gridlock and direct confrontation and a lot of racket. But I do think this has been a problematic one for the government, because they were seriously blindsided, and to a degree of intensity that I haven't seen before, by the First Nations Leadership Council, which is a group they would prefer to have support from. And the FNLC has not been shy to put out scorching press releases when it wanted to, and John Horgan was on the receiving end of some of those, and so has David Eby been. But they've taken a much stronger, more difficult position now that they would prefer to kill the bill. They wanted it withdrawn. David Eby had a personal meeting with the top leadership and came out offering to require proponents, and maybe this was just in the renewable energy one, but the debate's been so confusing, I've had a hard time following it, require Indigenous equity in private sector projects for them to be fast-tracked. And that may have its own repercussions, because it may give quite a significant leverage to First Nations in areas where people want to do development, but the First Nations not satisfied with its share of the pie. So it'll be a very interesting final week, and not an easy debate, especially if they have to impose some kind of closure on all of these organizations, which you've mentioned.
All right. Can we move from that to, I'm going to say we're going to adapt a love triangle into a grump triangle. And that grump triangle has corners of Gary Begg, David Eby, and Eleanor Sturko. Specifically because I guess I'll summarize this as Eleanor Sturko protecting her sources relative to documents that were leaked to her regarding safe supply. And then we went on a journey, poor Eleanor Sturko, from being investigated to exonerated pretty quickly between Gary Begg and David Eby.
Gary Begg and Eleanor Sturko, both former RCMP officers, too.
Right.
Just to add a little texture to that.
Yeah. And what was happening there? Did Gary Begg Jeff, do you have a sense of did Gary Begg just get ahead of Premier Eby, or what?
Well, I'm going to make a bit of a stretch here. I don't want the show to go by without mentioning ostriches. If there's this encampment of people who are concerned about the proposed call, a federal decision of ostriches, which have been found to be infected with avian flu. Okay. Mm-hmm. Millions and millions of poultry have been destroyed already under similar orders in the valley, where there are farmers who have huge operations, far, far, far more significant economically than the ostriches. But I'm sure there's someone in Ottawa going, is there a security threat if we send an inspector in past these trucker convoy people who are now concerned, along with RFK Jr., about the possibility of these birds being culled? And no one in the political sphere can make such an inquiry. There's a very, very strong wall between policing in government and politics in government. So nobody in Ottawa should be able to call the police and say, hey, you're going to give us a hand when it comes time to kill the birds, right? They can't make the call. They can't receive such a call. So Gary Begg learns from reporters that somebody from the RCMP phoned Eby-Begg-Sturko and said, we're investigating you about the leak related to the safe supply issue. And she's outraged, of course. And Gary Begg goes, well, I knew nothing about this, but I'm not supposed to know anything about it. And it's up to those guys in the policing service who report to me on the org chart but never speak to me to go ahead and do these kinds of investigations. And this explanation, which I've just given, was already like 10 times too long for a clip in a scrum. So confronted on the same issue, the Premier goes, that's insane.
Right.
Gary Begg needs to rethink this whole thing, or some words to those effect. I'm quoting.
Gary Begg is the ostrich?
Who's the owl?
Gary Begg is the guy who will not be able to do anything to protect or hurt the ostriches. And so he had to write an apology by the end of the day to say the Premier's clarified what I meant to say was.
Yeah, tough day.
The Premier
Gary Begg needs an airbag.
The Premier then sent Shannon Salter, who I'm going to mention in my toast. She's the deputy to the Premier. He sent her because the Premier can't phone this guy in the police service, running police services either, and said, we think you should consider that this is not a priority. So to me, it's a very interesting case, but also a sort of a communications train wreck for the government in terms of issues management, which I think is too bad because I have a lot of time for Gary Begg.
There's a lot going on with that story.
Yeah.
I thought we didn't have ostriches in the list, and I could not let the show go by without raising ostriches, because I think we're going to
ostriches. Michael Bryant.
Ostriches, Glenn
Michael
Clark,
Bryant.
West.
Okay,
Set them all on one thing. All one
okay,
set.
Mike, over to you, Michael Bryant.
Let's do Michael Bryant because former guest of the pod got also the focus of some unwanted media attention when his contract to go figure out and help out on the downtown east side was the topic in question period. The Conservatives are pretty incensed by this, and I think also kind of a communications challenge because I think half of it is just that it was sort of a surprise to everybody that this was happening. Mike, is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty controversial topic, and anytime a consultant's getting paid, six figures, is going to be noteworthy. And Michael Bryant's, obviously has a past that is, we talked about it on the podcast last year about what happened with him in Toronto with that accident.
There's a great case by why he's a really uniquely, qualified person to do this, and that,
Yeah, I mean, I think sure. Does Michael Bryant have something to offer to this issue? I'm sure he does.
Sure,
I'm sure he's a very,
legal aid, former AG in Ontario, his own personal journey. Yeah.
But it just the way they went about it, it wasn't transparent. I mean, you don't necessarily have to announce every contract you've ever left.
But you could do a little.
You're putting them in the
this.
middle of a very stakeholder-rich environment.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was
there's a thing called, I believe it's called the Community Resources Network, which is a roundtable of most of the significant organizations in the downtown east side who read about his appointment in the paper. Yeah. So they went seriously negative because they just had no idea. Bryant was Attorney General of Ontario. He had legal services. He said controversial time periods during his career, some very controversial. I agree with your comment, Kate. However, I had heard a few weeks before the storm broke that he was working down there. It wasn't clear to me what his terms of reference were, what he was doing, where it would be reported to. But I was surprised and not surprised to see Premier Eby say that he had gotten to know Michael Bryant when he was running legal services and Premier Eby was Attorney General. And so this appears to have been a decision by the Premier to appoint someone to, inside the budget of poverty reduction, to do some extra work and give some extra advice, because clearly Sheila Malcolmson was really not prepared to answer questions on it either and had never put out a release. So I think it's another example last week of ready, shoot, aim. And there needs to be a lot more work done to get on top of those kinds of questions, because it was about a day of bad news.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's crippled his work, whatever he might have been able to achieve.
It's unfortunate. Yeah. He's a really good fit. He's also a very strong communicator. In Ontario, he outflanked the premier often. SHE, he's quite strong.
No wonder he had to leave the province.
Well, anyway, I hope that comes to a better place and good work can come from that. Let's do some double dipping discussions. So really, really quickly, just new MLA, Darlene Rochford has advanced a private members bill to ban MLAs from holding local government office. This takes aim at two conservatives who hold municipal councillor seats, I guess probably through 2026, right? And she's saying, this is double dipping. This should stop. Geoff, you're our guy. You're our in-house guy to tackle this one. Do you think, is this double dipping? And does it make sense?
Well, if you take both salaries, if people take both salaries, it is ridiculous. I mean, if you're running for MLA and you win, then you should go be the MLA. If you want to avoid the by-election costs for your local community, then don't take the money. You shouldn't take the money under any circumstances, because being an MLA is more than a full-time job. So, I don't think it's really one of those questions that arises after a number of elections. It's a problem for a few MLAs right now. But in the past, if people really wanted to avoid the by-election costs, which was an issue in 2017 for a number of MLAs, they preferred to give up the pay than to trigger the by-election.
Go on leave for 6 months just to get to the period where they don't cause a by-election.
And, I think that's fine, frankly. The bottom very minimum is you can't take the money. You also probably can't perform at the other job. So you really have to ask yourself why you're continuing at all.
Yeah, I don't think you should serve two masters. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think especially if you hold a cabinet portfolio, you can't be also a member of a municipal council. You can't do it. So I'm not opposed to this bill, but I don't know that it's that big a deal.
Well, I'm sympathetic to not making it harder to get people to run provincially, because municipal politics is a big,
feeding
farm system for provincial politics. If the government truly cared about it, then they would probably make it easier for municipalities not to have to call a by-election.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And then you wouldn't have the issue of cost for by-elections. Like these Vancouver by-elections that happened with the 3-mile long lineups to vote recently. I mean, that was probably millions of dollars to run those by-elections, because Christine Boyle got elected. And
it was over 2 million, I think.
Yeah. And at least Adrian Carr jumped on the opportunity to leave office without costing any more money. But anyways, the debate will rage on.
All right. We'll come back to it. All right. This has been a full day. We need to go grab a drink. Geoff, you want to kick us off today?
Yeah, I have a long list of stuff. That's why I just wanted to say.
Me too.
That's why I insisted on saying ostriches earlier. The one thing I really want to point to, which I think is a problem that's emerging for the provincial government and is a very serious one, is public sector bargaining. And I rely almost 100% for what I know about this on a column in the last few days by Vaughn Palmer, who reported that Shannon Salter, who is the deputy to the premier, was part of a basically public service-wide town hall meeting where one of her deputies presented an economic statement to all of those workers, all of whom are members of the BC Government Employees Union, explaining how difficult the government's fiscal picture is, and painting a really bleak picture. It generated some further demoralizing headlines about $100 billion deficits and so on if it's not reined in. In labor relations terms, this suggests to me that bargaining is going nowhere with the union, which is leading all of the other public service unions, and the expiry of their collective agreement would have been March 31st. You wouldn't normally have a deal by now by any means, unless it was a special year, but you would have a general idea about where things were going. So when I look at the Brenda Bailey, the finance minister's messaging, I mostly see her saying, I'm committed to trying to reduce debt to GDP ratio over time, and I'm not going to cut public services. Very hard to make those two things work at the same time. What is the union saying? Well, not really clear either. But they're saying in their ads that we should invest in public services. So I think we're seeing an immovable block to an irresistible force here, because Brenda Bailey somehow has to bring down, as their team emphasized to all these workers in a captive audience meeting, which is what I would call it in labor relations terms. You got to get serious here. And how this plays out, I don't know. There was a strike for 2 weeks in a very narrow part of the public service, mostly corrections, when I was working for the John Horgan government. So the BCGU is not afraid to take strike votes. It's not afraid to exercise those strike votes. But I don't see where the room is for Brenda Bailey and David Eby to make a deal with the public sector unions without some significant downward pressure on spending. So early warning sign, not good. Vaughn had some other details, which I'll leave out right now, but I'm not raising a glass. I'm proposing a worrisome, a shot at all the players there, that it's time to really bear down on this, clarify the bargaining objectives, and start doing some serious talking.
So yeah, Geoff doesn't raise a glass, doesn't take a shot. He raises a worried, pointed finger.
No, it's a shot. I'll make it a full shot.
Oh, it's a shot. Okay.
Yeah. Everybody involved. Like, we should know in general terms now what the mandate is to the people on the employer side. Normally, there's some statement made that we cannot afford to give you more than inflation. And in that, say, 1.7%, you can, make some deals, and we could maybe do some changes that would be helpful. And, we won't make any concessions. There's a general framework. We haven't heard that. Nor on the union side have we really heard as clearly as we did, say, 4 years ago, that they wanted to full inflation protection. That was a wage compensation round of bargaining. So we'll see. But it's not a great way to start hearing public news about these critical issues.
Thanks, Geoff.
Kate,
Mike?
before you landed on our shores, British Columbia,
Yes, sir.
there was a time of successful collective bargaining between the government and the public sector unions with affordable labor agreements of 0, 0, and 2, and even a 6-year agreement with the BCTF. But
Tell me more of these utopic
days are over.
Just to be clear,
the Christy Clark government ran its course. But,
Kate didn't cause that change.
But there was a time, Kate. There was a time when these things happened, and there was a very few days lost to labor stoppages.
Well, the housing market was probably stronger, I guess. Hey, Mike?
Well,
I guess BC is broken, Mike.
Different. There was a different time. But Geoff put an end to it. Anyways, I will raise a glass. I'm not Mr. Poopy Pants like Geoff here. I'm very positive, very glass half full today.
Well, that's so your brand.
Raise a glass to Doug Call, who retired from the Premier's office, Deputy Minister. I don't know Doug particularly well, but by reputation, sterling reputation. And for benefit of the listeners, it's important to understand that the Premier's office public service side of things is pretty lean. We have a pretty decentralized government in British Columbia, and Doug was one of 2 or maybe 3 deputy ministers in the Premier's office that was quarterbacking things from the center, and particularly leaning in on natural resources, Indigenous, environment, the nexus of those things meeting. So a really important person in terms of the government, business, First Nations relationship in British Columbia. So he's retiring, and good for him. And I believe Tom McCarthy has moved over from Indigenous relations to that role in the Premier's office. So he'll pick that up, and he'll be that important troubleshooter, strategist, whatever it takes, working with Shannon Salter. So anyways, Doug, good luck in your retirement. I'm sure we haven't seen the last of you.
Yeah. Good one. Here. All right. I'm going to do a little 2-4 because I'll do a traditional kind of raised glass, because I just want to say, I'm going to raise my glass to Eleanor Sturko, because I have to say how she handled this protecting her sources piece was perfect. And I think she did, she played the politics a bit, but she also really leaned back. And I was really pleased to see this just on the principle of creating a safe environment for people to raise concerns and share them and have something come of it. Like, that's very important. And I think I appreciate that she kind of did both. And I thought she was really pitch perfect in how she handled that. So my glass is raised to her as someone who's been on that protecting sources challenge before. And I will this other one is more complicated, but I can't let it pass because so I was just looking at the latest inflation data for Canada, right? And we have this downtick due largely to the carbon tax, and it's a small shift, that takes us from, I can't remember what it is, but kind of just above 2.3% inflation, maybe down to 1.7 are the estimates. And within it, a lot of the other indices, and it's largely on the back, of gas, and a lot of the other indices are up. And it's just kind of this depressing moment because I think I just want to reflect that. I'm someone who, agrees that it was time for the tax to go. I'm not kind of trying to say that it needed to stay or anything like that. But it's a sad moment because the carbon tax always was this kind of free market version of climate policy. And I think, which is a great idea. And the legacy of it is going to be for Canadians that we see climate action as expensive. And often with these policy pieces, as they're enacting, they can be the right thing for the moment. And then how they age and what their legacy is kind of impossible to know. And so I don't know what this is. This is a shot of some sort directed somewhere about just the bummer of those latest inflation numbers.
You're too low.
Well, I'm glad to see them down. I think it's just like, it's kind of like all that sturm and drang and all that, like, oh no, the carbon tax is ruining my life. And it's like, like, it's gone now. And like, yeah, there's some good stuff there, but there's some, I guess what this shows is, while voters are really pissed and really struggling with affordability, we really kind of hung our hats and directed our ire at that one issue. And obviously, it's going to be a barrier, I think, to...
I'm having a Gordon Campbell episode flashback listening to you about the carbon tax. So.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. I'm sure we'll have some kind of occasion to talk about this, but I think that we've kind of seen what the legacy of this is as of now, and it's a bummer.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Mike tried to bring our mood up, and I just what do you call it? Poopy pantsing? Yeah, all right.
You're Mrs. Poopy Pants. Yeah.
I'm Mrs. Poopy Pants this week. I'll own it. It's all good. I'll try and bring back the hyperbole. It's a little lighter. All right. I want to thank our guest, Jatinder Rai, for joining us today. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and FortisBC. We'll see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.